The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Camille Bryant's wrists as flashbulbs popped and strangers gasped, none of them realizing they were watching the director of the National Counterterrorism Command being detained like a common threat. She had warned them. But they didn't see power in a black woman with a briefcase, they only saw suspicion, and by the time they learned who she was, the nation was already watching. It was 10:46 p.m. when Camille Bryant stepped off Gate 34B at Denver International Airport, her heels tapping steadily across the polished floor like a metronome of silent authority. No press, no security entourage, no aides carrying bags, just her. At 49, Camille was the newly appointed director of the National Counterterrorism Command, a position that made her one of the most powerful federal officials in the country. But tonight, there was no red carpet. Just the quiet hum of late-night travelers and the muted buzz of overhead announcements echoing across the cavernous terminal. She walked with the ease of someone used to heavy rooms and heavier decisions. Her navy blue pantsuit was perfectly pressed, understated. Her gray briefcase, secured with biometric locks, never left her side. Inside it, reports from a classified operation that had ended hours earlier in San Diego. She hadn't slept in nearly 30 hours. But her posture didn't show it. Camille didn't rush. She never rushed. She scanned the terminal casually, exits ahead, coffee stand to the left, cleaning crew in orange vests wheeling carts, and kept walking. Then she saw them. 2 airport officers near the far service kiosk. White. Mid-30s. One with a tight buzz cut and a radio clipped to his shoulder. The other twirling a TSA-issued flashlight in his hand. They stood casually at first, chatting, laughing. But as she passed them, they shifted. Buzz cut, his name tag read Blake, gave his partner a nudge and tilted his head in her direction. A signal. Camille had seen that look before. The one that says she doesn't belong here. She didn't make eye contact. Didn't flinch. Just kept walking. Her instincts told her to brace, but her training told her not to show it. "Ma'am," a voice called out behind her, sharp and clipped. She stopped. Slowly turned. Officer Blake and his partner, Officer Carson, were walking toward her. She kept her face neutral. "Are you traveling alone tonight?" Blake asked, his tone patronizing, as if she were a child on a school field trip. "Yes," she replied, calm but direct. "May I ask where you're headed?" Carson added, his thumb resting a little too close to his belt, where his baton hung like a quiet threat. Camille tilted her head slightly. "Is there a problem?" Her voice was steady. Smooth. The kind that made federal agents sit up straighter in briefing rooms. "We've had a notice out," Blake said. "You match a description." "Of what?" she asked. "Of someone potentially carrying unverified government material." Carson glanced at her briefcase. "We're going to need to take a look inside that case, ma'am." Camille's fingers tightened around the handle, just slightly. "No, you're not," she said. "Excuse me?" Blake asked, eyes narrowing. "I'm Camille Bryant, Director of the National Counterterrorism Command. This briefcase contains classified federal material. If you want to open it, you'll need 3 levels of authorization and a warrant." She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her credentials, government-issued, photo ID, encrypted seal, all of it. She held it out. Blake didn't take it. He gave a short laugh, exchanged a glance with Carson. "You expect us to believe that?" he asked. "You can get these printed in 5 minutes at any print shop." "I don't expect you to believe it," Camille replied. "I expect you to verify it. Call your supervisor. Or better yet, call Homeland Security." "Let's not make this difficult," Carson said, stepping forward. "Put the briefcase down." "You do not have jurisdiction over this material," she said, her tone sharpening. "Back off." "Hands where I can see them," Blake barked, his voice echoing across the terminal. People began to turn. A woman pushing a stroller paused. A man in a suit glanced over his shoulder. Someone pulled out a phone. Camille didn't raise her voice. She didn't move. "This is a mistake," she said firmly. But they weren't listening. Carson lunged forward and grabbed her briefcase. "Do not touch that," she snapped. Too late. He yanked it from her hand, dropped it to the floor with a heavy thud. The lock panel flashed red in protest. "That's a felony," she warned. "On your part." "Turn around," Blake said. "You're under federal investigation." Camille didn't resist as he grabbed her arm and twisted it behind her back. But she didn't help them either. The cuffs clicked shut. Phones recorded. The crowd grew. She was being arrested like a criminal. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said as they shoved her toward a bench. "You're detaining a federal official." "Save it for the judge," Carson said, smug. But then something shifted. "Wait a second," a deep voice called out. From behind the crowd, a tall black man in a worn army jacket stepped forward. "Hold up. That's Director Bryant. I saw her testify on C-SPAN just last week. She's not lying." Blake froze. "Who the hell are you?" "Retired Master Sergeant Ellis," the man said. "And you're making the biggest mistake of your career." Blake looked uncertain. Carson stared at the ID still on the floor. He picked it up. Looked again. Then the radio on Blake's shoulder crackled. "All units, Terminal C, DHS en route. Possible code 7. High-level federal personnel compromised." Blake's face paled. "Code 7? Carson whispered. "That's high clearance." "You think," the veteran said, arms crossed. "You laid hands on the director of NCC. And there are cameras." Seconds later, 3 Homeland Security agents came through the doors, earpieces in place, suits sharp. One walked directly up to Camille. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" "No," she said quietly. "But they will be." "Uncuff her." Now, the lead agent snapped. Carson fumbled with the key. His hands shook. The cuffs fell away. Camille didn't rub her wrists. She stood up, adjusted her blazer, and turned to the 2 officers. "You'd better hope your command is better prepared than you were tonight." She picked up her briefcase herself, ignored their mumbled apologies, and walked forward as if nothing had happened, except everything had. A camera crew that had been nearby filming a travel segment now had the entire scene on record. DHS took over the situation in full. Blake and Carson were pulled aside, their radios confiscated. One of them tried to explain, but was told to stop talking and wait for legal. Camille left the terminal in silence, but not before a teenage girl from the crowd looked up at her and whispered to her mother, "She's a boss." That night, Camille sat in the back seat of her government SUV, hands resting in her lap, watching the lights of Denver blur past the window. Her aide, Julia, sat beside her, tense. "Press is already on this," Julia said. "There are videos circulating. They know who you are." "Good," Camille replied. "Let them see." Julia hesitated. "What do you want to do?" Camille looked out the window, then down at the faint red marks on her wrists. She flexed her fingers. "Schedule a briefing. Tomorrow morning. And make sure they know, I'll be writing the statement myself." The morning air in Washington, D.C. was sharp with late autumn chill as Camille Bryant stepped up to the podium in the National Counterterrorism Command's press briefing room. Less than 12 hours had passed since she was wrongfully detained and handcuffed by 2 airport officers who didn't believe a black woman in a Navy pantsuit could lead one of the most powerful national security agencies in the country. The photos of her red-marked wrists had already made the rounds online. Videos of her being detained, composed and calm as the cuffs clicked closed on her, were all over social media. Reporters packed the room now, shoulders brushing, lenses clicking, notebooks ready. But Camille wasn't here to rage. She wasn't here to shame. She was here to lead. She stood behind the podium, wearing a crisp charcoal suit, no makeup beyond the essentials, and a quiet storm in her eyes. Her voice when it came was even, clipped, deliberate. I wasn't detained last night because of a threat I posed. I was detained because I didn't look like authority. The silence in the room was immediate. No coughing. No pen scratching. Every camera stopped zooming. Every hand stilled. I showed my identification. I followed every instruction. I remained calm. But I was not believed. Because I didn't match the image in someone else's head of who power is supposed to look like. Her hands rested lightly on the podium. She wasn't leaning into the moment. She was letting the moment lean into her. There will be questions, she continued. There always are when someone who looks like me steps out of line, when we don't apologize for showing up in rooms we're told weren't built for us. But this isn't about personal vengeance. I don't want those officers destroyed. I want them educated. I want them to ask themselves, and I want every person watching to ask themselves, what they would have done differently if I looked like someone else. Her message spread across newsrooms, classrooms, and corporate meetings within hours. Cable anchors replayed the footage. Social media exploded with hashtags. Schools debated her statement in ethics classes. Veterans weighed in. Politicians tried to make it about policy. But Camille stayed quiet. Until she walked into a private conference room 3 days later and sat face-to-face with officers Blake and Carson. There were no cameras. No aides. Just her, them, and a glass of water untouched in the center of the table. Blake looked nervous. Carson fidgeted with his pen. Neither of them could meet her eyes. Camille began without a file, without a notepad. Just her voice. "Let me ask you something," she said, folding her hands on the table. "When I told you I was director of the NCC, did either of you pause, just for a second, to wonder if it might be true?" Carson cleared his throat. We didn't recognize you. We were doing our job." "No," she said softly but firmly. "You were doing your instinct. Your job would have been to verify my credentials. Your instinct was to assume I was lying." Blake looked down at the table. Camille leaned back slightly, not accusing, but not relenting either. "Let me tell you something about how I got here," she said. "I grew up in New Orleans. My mom raised 3 of us on a teacher's salary. I got into West Point on a scholarship. I served 12 years in field intelligence before transitioning to counterterrorism. I've worked operations across 3 continents, briefed 5 presidents, and passed every clearance check the federal government can throw at someone." She paused. "And none of that mattered to you because you couldn't picture someone like me holding this much authority." Carson shifted in his seat. "It wasn't about race," he muttered. Camille didn't blink. "Then what was it?" The silence that followed was thick. No one had an answer. Because the answer was obvious. After a long pause, Camille said, "I'm not here to demand an apology. I'm here to tell you that this can't happen. Again. Not to me. Not to the next woman who walks into your terminal in heels and a badge. Not to the next black girl with a briefcase and a future you don't recognize." Blake finally looked up. His voice was barely above a whisper. "You're right. We didn't see it." "Then start seeing it," she replied. "Start unlearning what you think power looks like." That evening, she convened a private meeting with her senior staff at NCC. Not about retaliation. About reform. The list she proposed was direct, surgical, and built from experience. Mandatory anti-bias training for federal partners. Updated protocol on public stops involving high-clearance personnel. Real-time authentication systems connected to a secure federal database. She insisted on transparent reporting mechanisms that couldn't be swept aside with bureaucratic jargon. And she pushed for something else, something quieter. Every new airport officer in high-traffic federal hubs would now receive a briefing titled Assumptions in Uniform, centered on identifying bias, not just in others, but in themselves. She knew reform wasn't flashy. It was infrastructure. Quiet. Often thankless. But necessary. The next week, a letter arrived at her office in a plain envelope, no return address. Inside, a single page written in cursive. Director Bryant, I served 31 years in the U.S. Marshals. I've pinned medals on good men and had to fire others for things they couldn't unlearn. I watched your press conference. It didn't make me angry. It made me ashamed. I was one of those men who couldn't see past the uniform or the face. I thought I was better than that. Your words reminded me I still have work to do. I'm retired now, but I promise I'll spend the rest of my days trying to be the man I always believed I already was. Thank you. Camille read it 3 times before folding it and placing it in her top desk drawer. Not as a trophy, but as a marker. That was the difference. She hadn't asked for applause. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't demanded anyone be canceled or dragged or torn down. She'd simply held the mirror steady and asked everyone watching to look into it. What she saw now, weeks later, wasn't shame. It was awakening. And that, she knew, would last longer than punishment ever could. Her inbox was flooded with messages from civic leaders, educators, police departments, even corporations asking for guidance, for partnership, for training. Camille didn't respond to all of them. But she read every one. She began sketching the outline of a new program, a federal state-local training pipeline designed not to punish error, but to prevent it. Not to make headlines. To make change. She wasn't interested in being a symbol. She wanted to be a solution. That was the work. That was the mission. One that didn't end with applause. It began with responsibility. And she wasn't done yet. Not even close. Weeks had passed since Camille Bryant stood at that podium and told the country a truth it wasn't prepared to ignore. Her words had ignited headlines, op-eds, roundtable debates, and late-night segments, but Camille herself remained absent from all of it. She turned down interviews from major networks, refused invitations from primetime anchors, and left magazine profile requests unanswered. She had no interest in becoming a symbol. Symbols can be forgotten. What Camille wanted was traction, concrete, lasting, institutional change. And that work, she knew, didn't happen in green rooms or glossy covers. It happened in boardrooms, classrooms, and behind closed doors where no one clapped. That was where she chose to be. She'd already begun laying the foundation, quietly but deliberately. Her recommendations, mandatory anti-bias training for federal and airport security officers, updated field protocols for credential verification, and real-time supervisory contact requirements, had all been accepted. Now, she was leading a federal task force to implement them across the country. But her vision didn't stop there. Camille knew that true change didn't just mean cleaning up messes after they happened. It meant reaching the next generation before the damage was done. And so, one chilly Friday morning, she found herself standing in front of 300 high school students at a public magnet school in Atlanta. The auditorium buzzed with energy as she stepped onto the stage, not in her usual federal suit but in a simple, soft gray blouse and dark slacks. No podium this time. No cameras. Just her, a lapel mic, and a room full of eyes that were still deciding what kind of world they were walking into. She spoke with the same calm she always carried. People will try to define you, she said, her voice quiet but commanding, based on what they expect of you. They'll decide how far you'll go before you've even taken your first step. But here's what I want you to remember: you define yourself based on what you build. Silence. Not because they weren't listening, but because they were. She told them about her childhood in New Orleans. About being raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs and still found time to quiz her on world capitals and constitutional amendments at the dinner table. About her first day at West Point, where she walked into the barracks and realized she was the only black woman in her training unit. About learning not just how to carry weight on her shoulders, but how to carry it without letting it reshape her. When you walk into a room, she said, don't ask yourself if you belong there. Ask what you're going to do with the space once you have it. Applause didn't erupt, it bloomed, slow but full. These weren't students clapping because they were told to. These were students who had seen themselves in her words, who understood that leadership isn't always loud, it's consistent. After the talk, she stayed longer than her schedule allowed, speaking with a line of students one by one. Some asked about national security. Some just wanted to hug her. One girl, no older than 16, handed Camille a folded piece of notebook paper. Camille didn't open it until she got back to her office. In careful handwriting, the note read, "They tried to silence you with cuffs, but you spoke louder by standing tall. Thank you for showing me I can be powerful without shouting." Camille folded the letter carefully and placed it in the same drawer that now held the handwritten note from the retired U.S. Marshal. These weren't mementos. They were markers. Proof of movement. Later that night, long after the building had emptied and her aides had gone home, Camille sat at her desk in silence. The city glowed faintly through the windows behind her. Her office, lined with books and awards, was quiet, save for the soft hum of the ventilation system. Her briefcase sat by the door, unopened since she arrived. And on her desk sat a letter, yellowed with time, creased from age. It was from her mentor, written to her the night she was first appointed deputy director. She'd read it a dozen times before, but tonight she needed it again. "They'll question your presence," it said. "Make sure they never question your principles." She set the letter down and slowly rubbed her wrists, her fingers brushing over the spots where the cuffs had bruised her skin. The marks had faded, but she could still feel them. Not as pain, but as purpose. Those cuffs had been meant to shame her. They hadn't. They'd simply drawn a line between who she was and what the world had expected of her. She hadn't just crossed it. She'd redrawn it. Outside her office, the building was dark. But Camille stood, put on her coat, and walked the corridor slowly, her heels echoing off the marble floors. She passed the framed photos of former NCC directors, every one of them white, every one of them male, until hers appeared at the end of the hall. A quiet presence in the middle of a noisy legacy. She didn't linger. She didn't need to. By now, her impact was rooted deeper than any frame could hold. As she stepped into the elevator, she thought back to that night at the airport. The way Officer Blake's hand had gripped her arm. The way the bystanders had watched. The way the teenager with the phone had whispered, "She's a boss," before pressing record. They tried to shrink her into a threat that night. But the nation had seen something else, a woman who stood unshaken while being dragged. A woman who didn't respond with fury but with facts. Who didn't demand retribution, but offered reform. And in that response, she had become something more than a target. She had become a blueprint. Camille stepped out into the cool night air and walked toward her government-issued SUV. As the driver opened the door, she paused, looked back once at the federal building behind her, then slid into the back seat. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Because the world had already heard what she needed them to hear. And what they did next would define what kind of country they truly wanted to be. The system had tried to reduce her to a moment. But Camille Bryant wasn't a moment. She was momentum. And what she did next, what she kept doing, was what history would remember. As the author of Camille Bryant's story, I want to offer a reflection that goes beyond the headlines and the handcuffs, because what happened to Camille wasn't just about a single night at an airport. It was about everything that night revealed. This story reminds us that perception and power often collide in painful ways, especially when someone doesn't look the part according to someone else's limited definition. Camille didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her strength came from her presence, her clarity, and her refusal to let injustice go unchallenged. She reminded us that dignity can be a form of protest, and that reform can come not just from fury, but from focus. One of the most important lessons here is that true leadership doesn't demand attention, it earns it. Camille didn't ask for applause. She asked for awareness. She asked for systems to do better, for people to question their assumptions, and for authority to be exercised with humility, not ego. In doing so, she turned a moment of public humiliation into a catalyst for institutional change. To those listening, especially those who've been underestimated, misjudged, or silenced, let this be your reminder that you are not defined by how others see you. You are defined by how you stand, how you respond, and how you persist. Whether you lead from the front, the side, or in quiet corners of your community, your voice matters. Your presence matters. And when the time comes, how you carry yourself may change more than just your own path. It may shift the ground beneath others too. And to those in positions of power, I offer this: don't assume. Don't reduce. And never forget that real authority starts with accountability. It takes courage to admit mistakes and even more to grow from them. Camille didn't call for punishment, she called for perspective. And that's what moved the nation. On behalf of our channel, U.S. Instructive Stories, I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us in exploring stories that spark thought, challenge assumptions, and hopefully inspire change. If Camille's journey moved you, share it. Talk about it. Reflect on it. Because change doesn't begin in courts or press rooms, it begins in hearts, homes, and conversations like this one. Thank you for listening, for thinking deeper, and for being part of a community that believes stories can shape a more just and compassionate America. Until next time, stay thoughtful, stay bold, and keep walking with your head held high.